Hi, I'm Augie Sallas. I'm the host of Political Roundtable, and my guest today is Paul Simon, professor at Southern Illinois University, director of Public Policy Institute of SIU, and he's a retired U.S. Senator from Illinois. I want to welcome my guest on Political Roundtable, Paul Simon. Welcome to our...
Thank you, Augie. Great to be with you. We've been friends for, I don't know how long, 25 or more years, and it's good to be with you.
Thank you so much for coming with us to our show. I'd like to talk about your recent trip, Paul, to Cuba. Paul Simon went to Cuba several months back. I want to show you a little picture of Cuba here. And Senator, would you tell us about Cuba? Tell us about your trip. What was the purpose of the trip, and how long were you in Cuba?
Well, as you mentioned, I'm now teaching at Southern Illinois University, and we talked about the possibility of having an exchange of students and faculty members with the University of Havana or some other university there. And so the president of Southern Illinois University and I and several others went down there. And then while I was there, it's my first trip to Cuba, I might mention. But while I was there, I had a meeting with Fidel Castro, 5 hours and 45 minutes. I've never met with a county clerk for 5 hours and 45 minutes. But there's no question he's a fascinating person, very bright, very alert, very on top of things. But there's no question he's also a dictator. But is, and I visited a lot of countries. I've visited over 100 countries around the world. In terms of dictatorships, he's not as harsh as most dictators are, but it is still a dictatorship. It's not a democracy.
Now, you said you had a meeting with him with 5 hours and 45 minutes.
That is correct.
Okay, now what did you talk to him about in those 5 hours and 45 minutes?
5 hours and 45 minutes, we talked about everything. We talked about American politics. We talked about what he was doing in Cuba on healthcare and education. And in those two areas, there's just no question he's made a significant contribution to the people of Cuba, and they're very, very much aware of that. And they take pride. Now, there are some, one of the good things is some of them are very openly critical of him, or they don't like the system. They like to have less socialism there, but they're gradually moving away from that. But we talked about baseball. He talked about the possibility of having an exchange with the Chicago White Sox, where the Cuban team would come up here and then the White Sox would go down there. Of course, in 5 hours and 45 minutes, you can talk about everything. He wanted to talk about the books I had written, and he asked me which is my favorite book, and I said that's like asking which is my favorite child. But it was a good meeting, and I came away feeling that Cuba has able leadership. But again, I would prefer a democracy.
Now, we have some photos here we want to show our viewers. Here's a photo that I guess that yourself with President Fidel Castro and a young lady in the middle there. I guess she was the interpreter.
She was the interpreter. He does understand some English, and if I ask a short question, sometimes he would give a short answer in English, but usually we work through the interpreter.
I see. And we had some other photos here that we want to show our viewers. Here's another picture of yourself, and the other gentleman is...
It's Dr. James Walker, the president of Southern Illinois University. He's a new president there, and to his credit, he was willing to make that trip to Cuba, which is, frankly, a little controversial. You get some people who are unhappy about doing something like that.
Now, the trip was, how many days did you say it was?
Well, some of the others stayed longer. I was down there for 4 days.
4 days?
Yeah.
Okay, we have another photo here that we'd like to show our viewers.
And that's when we just came there. Fidel Castro was welcoming us there. And we got, he frequently meets at midnight with people.
Is that a fact?
And I indicated to his staff, because I had an idea before we went down that I would be meeting with him, because they'd indicated that to me. And I said, I'm not good at meeting at midnight. I said, at 2 a.m. I'm ready to go to bed. And so I came to the hotel to have lunch, and they said, President Fidel Castro would like to meet with you, and he'll be ready in 10 minutes. So I didn't have a chance. As you can see from the picture, I didn't have a chance to put on a tie or do anything. We just went on over and had our meeting with him.
Now, Paul, let's talk about the issue of the embargo on Cuba. Tell us about your position. Tell us what it's about. Tell us when it started, actually, and why.
Well, it started with the idea that the embargo would, and what we mean by an embargo is we don't trade with Cuba. And obviously the United States is, or had been, the #1 trading partner, because we're just 90 miles from Cuba, the Florida coast. And the aim was to topple Castro. Well, Castro's been in power 42 years now. We've had 9 presidents of the United States. It obviously just isn't working. And today now, Secretary of State Colin Powell and President Bush are talking about taking off the embargo against Iraq, against Saddam Hussein, and except for military weapons. And Fidel Castro is, as I said, he's not a promoter of democracy, but he is sure a long way from being a Saddam Hussein.
He's not really a threat to our country.
He's not a threat at all. Has not invaded any other country. They have freedom of religion. You know, you have priests in the Roman Catholic Church that are tied to the Vatican. You have Baptist churches tied to American Baptist leadership. And yet we recognize China, we recognize North Korea, we recognize Vietnam. You know, you start going through these lists of countries with dictatorships that are much harsher than Castro. And an embargo works only when all the nations, or virtually all the nations, work on it. It worked in South Africa because Western Europe, the United States, countries of Africa, all of us had the economic boycott, the embargo on South Africa. In the case of Cuba, there is no other country in the world that joins us in this embargo. In fact, there are only 2 countries in the world where it's illegal for citizens to travel to Cuba unless you do it as part of an educational mission or something like that. Now, those 2 nations are North Korea and the United States of America. My own belief is that part of freedom of speech and the freedom that Americans ought to have is we ought to be able to travel anywhere as long as there isn't a safety question involved. And so I think we ought to be able to travel to Iraq and Iran and all kinds of places where there are controversies, but we went through the same thing with the Soviet Union, you will recall, Augie. There were those who said, let's boycott the Soviet Union, let's not trade with them, let's not have exchanges. And some of us said, the way to change them is to have exchanges, to have trade. And fortunately, we went out, and communism, as we knew it in the old Soviet Union, is dead.
Now, this embargo, Paul, what I understand is you're saying it doesn't work.
It doesn't work. It hurts Cuba and it hurts the United States. Mm-hmm. We have the cars in Cuba. The American cars are 57 Fords, Chevrolets, and Studebakers. Your younger viewers here won't even know what I'm talking about when I talk about a Studebaker. Right. But the new cars are Japanese, Korean, German, French, Swedish. Mm-hmm. The tour buses, all made in Germany and Sweden. The new hotels being built down there, they're Swiss, they're Japanese, they're other countries. You don't find any Hyatts or Hiltons. We're not making any money down there. American farmers aren't able to sell our food products down there.
So what would change, how can this U.S. policy be changed, Paul?
It can be changed if enough citizens contact their senators, their House members. And for those of you in Illinois, that means contacting Senator Dick Durbin, Senator Peter Fitzgerald, saying, why don't we stop this crazy embargo? It just really doesn't make any sense. And contact your House member. This is one of those things where clearly there ought to be bipartisan agreement that we ought to be exchanging, and if we want to change Cuba and not just have an emotional binge, we ought to be lifting that embargo. We ought to, if instead of trying to stop Americans from going down there, we were encourage 200,000 more American tourists every year, I think we'd bring about much more change than we're doing with our present policy.
Well, Paul, you know, there's a lot of Cubans in Miami and all over the country that would oppose this
No
idea
question
of
about it.
lifting the embargo. How do you see their attitude or their sentiment changing? How can that happen?
Well, I would say my impression of the Cuban American community, and I'm sure there may be a few who are watching this program
Sure.
who differ with what I have to say. The older Cuban Americans tend to believe that we should continue to boycott Castro and have the embargo. The younger Cuban Americans have a very different, much more realistic attitude. Some of those who want to have that embargo are hoping to get their property back or other things, and of course they've already been able under American tax laws to write their losses off. So I don't think you're going to get much more than that.
I know it's a very emotional issue with the Cuban.
Just no question. It's a very emotional issue, and but basically it's a handful of people, particularly in Florida, who are dictating American policy, and that just doesn't make sense.
Do you think the policy would change under the George W. Bush presidency?
Well, that's one of the things that Fidel Castro and I talked about. I said I thought it was unlikely to change in the next 2 years because the president's brother, Jeb Bush, is running for re-election in Florida.
Right.
So I think the political reality is a complete change is not likely. But if we were to modify it a little and say Americans can travel to Cuba freely, that would help. You know, there are intermediate steps that we could take that I think most people recognize would really make sense.
Now, Paul, when you went to Cuba and you bought things, did you buy with American money or Cuban money?
American money, and they want that American money down there. But you're limited. You're limited to bringing back 2 boxes of cigars and 2 bottles of, I think it's rum. I forget what. It's terrible. I'm not I drink wine at dinner and that's about it. But so we, you know, I brought back 2 boxes of cigars and I'm not a cigar smoker, but I gave one to my son and who does enjoy a cigar, and gave another to another friend.
So American money is used.
Oh, no question about it. And they're eager for it. And a lot of Americans, you know, you go to Cuba, you go to Mexico and then go to Cuba, you go to Jamaica and then go to Cuba, you go to Canada and then go to Cuba. And so far as I know, no one has ever been prosecuted for doing that. Are you technically violating the law? Yes. But everyone who wants to go to Cuba, if you're willing to spend that extra money, you do it. And of course, we help. Then Mexican Airlines, Canadian Airlines, we help others, but not American Airlines that could be making some money on it.
Now, where actually did you go to in Cuba? What city?
I really just was in Havana, the capital city, and didn't get beyond that. Met with a number of officials and did other things like visiting medical clinics and things like that. But I didn't get a chance to go around the island, and one of these days I want to go back and I want to do that.
Now, Fidel, he's He's been in power for
42 years.
42 years, and it's not likely that the U.S. policy is going to change.
It isn't going to change. In fact, our policy really encourages Fidel Castro. I have the feeling, and I may be completely wrong on this, that he's not that unhappy with our policy, simply because his people, even people who don't like the governmental system they have, they're proud of Fidel Castro for standing up to the big bully United States.
I see. Now, what was your impression of the economy there? Is it the economy?
It's hurting. There's just no question about it. But he has given some basic protections, and you also have to give him credit in terms of health care and education. He has really lifted Cuba, but they are hurting because for a long time they got a lot of aid from the Soviet Union.
Correct.
And now when the Soviet Union collapsed, that aid ended. And so they are getting a little aid from Russia and from some other countries, but they're really building up the tourism industry. And you can, it is a fascinating place to visit. You have the beaches, but you also have old Havana. The only comparison I can make to some of your viewers will know about old San Juan, Puerto Rico. It's a little bit like old San Juan.
Now, are the people there, so you're saying that they somewhat accept the system that they're living under right now?
Well, there are a lot of them who would like some changes, and they talk about it openly. It's another indication that it's not that harsh a dictatorship. One of the ways I judge democracies is if I go into a country and they have pictures of the leader, whoever that is, all over the place, then you know it's a pretty severe dictatorship.
Dominant, yeah.
But in Cuba, there are a lot of pictures of Che Guevara and Jose Marti, who's one of the sort of the George Washington of Cuba, but not very many pictures of Fidel Castro. And people, for example, you can in Cuba, you can be a foreign correspondent for an American newspaper and write things that are critical of Castro, and you can get by with that. But you can't write for a Cuban newspaper, the same kind of thing. So again, it's not a democracy. Now, Fidel Castro, when we talked about this, and obviously he and I didn't agree on everything, but he said, well, we do polling among our people to see what they want, and well, polling is fine, but that's not the same as electing your government officials freely.
Now, you mentioned that there's freedom of religion in a
Yes.
sense. Is there freedom of the press?
There's
It's
not freedom
limited.
of the press, no.
Freedom of assembly?
Well, they do have, when you talk about assembly, they do have a parliament. And it's interesting, democracy has spread enough, so even I was in North Korea some years ago. Senator Frank Murkowski, a Republican senator from Alaska, and I were landed in the first American plane to land in North Korea since 1942. And even North Korea has a parliament, and they have a parliament in Cuba, but there is no question who sets policy. It's not the parliament.
Not the parliament. It's the same in Cuba then.
Yeah.
Fidel is the total power.
When I say the total power, obviously he shares that some with others, but his fingerprints are on just about everything down there.
Let me ask you this, Paul. I know it's on the mind of a lot of people. What's going to happen after Castro? What do you think would happen?
People who hope that after Castro there will be a sudden shift, I think, misunderstand the country. The two people that they talk about most as being successors, well, really three. One is Fidel's brother, who is their defense minister. And I think most people would view that as kind of an interim thing. The second is the president of their assembly down there, who's really the number 3 person in government. And then one who is not a national person, but the person who is the governor of the Havana district, and who incidentally is African. About 46% of the population has some African roots. And one of the things that Fidel Castro has done is he has not completely eliminated every bit of discrimination, but has made huge strides. And the African Cubans are very appreciative of that, and understandably are grateful to Castro.
So what you're saying, Paul, is that after Castro, it may not change. That form of government may not change.
It is. The funny thing is, it is gradually changing now, and that's hardly known. For example, you can be self-employed now. You can be a small employer and employ some people. You can, if you're a Swiss hotel chain or a Japanese hotel chain, you can move in and you can be 100% private. You know, now they do encourage some co-ownership by the Cuban government. But if you don't want to do it, you don't have to. So there is a shift away from the old socialist communist system to more of a free enterprise system, but it's a very gradual and doesn't apply to most parts of the economy.
So is the Chinese influence there, the Chinese trade a lot with Cuba?
Well, the Chinese do have some influence there. They are, the Chinese and North Koreans and Cuba, they're about the only
3 remaining
communist countries in the world.
Yeah.
And certainly in China, they have moved away from that quite a bit. It's still a very harsh dictatorship, much harsher than Cuba. It's interesting, China does not provide freedom of religion or all these other things that Castro does provide, and yet we snuggle up to China and do everything we can to please China, and we give the cold shoulder to Castro, who's right next door.
Now, you think that Cuba then is turning somewhat capitalistic?
Well, I think it's slowly moving in that direction, and I think it'll be something of a compromise, just as we have. Social Security is a government-run program. Now, you can call it socialistic or whatever you want. Our highways are government-run. You can call them socialistic if you want, but it's practical. And I think you will see that Cuba, like Western Europe has more things government-run than we do in the United States. But you have to ask what's practical, what will work best, government operation of this or private operation. And on some things, the answer is government operation. On other things, private operation.
Now, is there a lot of unemployment in Cuba? Do you know?
They give figures of fairly low unemployment, about around 4 or 5%. There are others there who say it's more like 20%. And I don't know who's right and who's wrong on that. But there is no question that our embargo is hurting the people of Cuba. And for example, a professor that I met at the University of Havana, he has cancer and is getting some pills that are made in the United States. Well, he has to buy them through England in order to get them. And of course, every time it transfers hands, it adds more money to the cost of those pills. Well, that doesn't help us at all, and it certainly hurts him. And so the Cubans are hurt, and we're hurt by it.
Approximately, can you tell what the population is of Cuba?
Well, I should remember that figure, and my recollection is it's about 8 million, but I may be wrong. It may be as high as 11 million. I'm just not sure, but it's somewhat less than the state of Illinois. I remember that.
Okay, we won't hold you to it.
Yeah, all right.
But the country itself, you're saying, is hurting. The people are hurting because of the boycott.
There's no question. They're hurting, and the buildings need, an awful lot of buildings need repair. They need paint. you can see, particularly in Old Havana, an area of great historic interest where there ought to be some repair of those buildings just to make sure they don't collapse. And but their economy is hurting enough. This is where if we took the embargo off, you would have American investment there. You'd have a lot more tourists going there. It would be of help to the United States. And I think part of freedom of speech is an ability to explore anything. We shouldn't be hampered by our government if there isn't any risk. Mm-hmm. Now, if the government doesn't want me to go to some country because there's a revolution on, Afghanistan right now maybe is not safe. But if it's safe, even though I think they have a terrible government, mm-hmm. I ought to have the right to go there.
Now, there isn't any real opposition to President Castro?
No formal opposition. If you want to privately criticize him, you can do that, no problem. If you want to form another political party,
you got a problem.
You got a problem.
Now, so that's interesting what you're saying. You're about Cuba and the people. What I had heard, Paul, was that if we lift the sanction or the boycott or the tariff against Cuba, that Castro would benefit more than the people.
No, that's just not true. It is. There is no question that the economy would be picked up, and it may be that politically he would benefit because the economy would pick up. But it's a little bit like Iraq. We have this economic boycott on Iraq, and Saddam Hussein is a brutal dictator. I've been to Baghdad, and I remember arriving there, and a few hours before I was there, Castro had just summarily executed an employee of the British consulate. But having said that, I think the Pope is correct when he said that when we have these economic embargoes on countries, unless it is a very unusual situation where all the nations join in it, you're not hurting the leader, you're hurting the people. And the UN report on Iraq shows we are causing the death of a lot of children there because they can't get the food and medicine that they need. And I think it's a mistake on our part, and I think the same for Cuba.
Okay, so the embargo is food and medicine against Cuba.
Food, medicine, everything.
Everything.
Now, they passed a bill that permits food and medicine. Now, you can, as a charity, you can take food down or medicine. But to sell it, we passed something that was in theory was supposed to modify that, but it had so many strings attached to it, it's not working.
So the pharmaceuticals couldn't do any business with Cuba?
They can't do any business directly. That's correct.
Now, Paul, now that the Senate has been turned over to the Democrats, do you think there may be a change in that policy?
I think that is very possible because you have Joe Biden, Senator from Delaware, is the new chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He has a very different attitude than Senator Jesse Helms, who from North Carolina, who was the chairman of the committee. And so I think there is a very real possibility that we'll see some legislation that will improve the situation. Now, whether the president will sign it or not, I don't know.
Now, when you were a United States Senator, Paul, were there other senators taking the same viewpoint as you were, the same position?
Yes. And in fact, when I remember when and I don't remember what the exact nature of the bill, but the whole question of the embargo came up, and I remember making a speech against it, and I remember Senator Chris Dodd from Connecticut also making a speech against it. But now I have noted quite a few senators of both political parties, former senators now, who have said, this really doesn't make any sense. And even, he withdrew the legislation, but Senator John Warner, Republican from Virginia, introduced some legislation suggesting that we ought to modify our policy. Well, he got some pressure and he withdrew his legislation. But it's clear he believes our policy is wrong.
Okay, so you don't see anything in the foreseeable future that it changes?
I don't think anything's likely to happen in the coming months, with the exception of some slight modifications. But one of the things that is going to be happening is I think some statements from some former public officials in this country who believe our policy doesn't make any sense. And you talk privately to almost any senator, any former ambassador to any country, and they all tell you, our policy just doesn't make any sense at all.
In today's newspaper, Paul, I was reading that there were some demonstrations in Europe when President George W. Bush was in Spain, I believe it was, and they were demonstrating for three things against President Bush: for the environment policy, for the death penalty policy, and for the Cuban policy.
Yeah. Well, and there may have been some demonstrations. I know there were scheduled some in Brussels, I think it is, on the missile shield. That's another thing. But I think Western European leaders, they kind of laugh when we talk about our policy. It's just viewed as I saw a statement by a writer for the Los Angeles Times when he describes our foreign policy as adolescent. And I thought it was a pretty good, pretty accurate description. It's not malicious, but it's not mature. We really ought to have.
You haven't grown up enough.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Well, Paul, your viewpoint on the Cuba embargo is interesting, and of course, and I know we'll have some viewers may want to contact you and talk to you about it. Is there a number or an address?
Well, they can reach me at the Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, Illinois, and the zip code is 62901. Let me repeat that.
Please.
Contact me at the Public Policy Institute, Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, Illinois, 62901.
Now, you also have a mail room number.
Well, that's just for internal.
Oh, internal. Okay.
Within the university.
I see. Well, Paul, let me ask you about the Public Policy Institute.
Thank you.
Tell us about that institute. Now,
I can get a commercial in here.
Tell us all about it.
Well, when I left the United States Senate, I did not want to become a lobbyist. I don't mean any disrespect to people who are lobbyists, and it's a legitimate part of our operation, but that's not my cup of tea. And I told my former colleagues, if I contact you on anything, it's because I believe in it, not because somebody's paying me to do it. I could have made a lot more money than I'm making now as a teacher, but as a teacher, I will maybe get a chance to mold things more in the future. And so we have this Public Policy Institute, and we differ from, I think, every other public policy institute in the nation. And then we have a bottom line: is it possible that something concrete can happen? And so when we have a symposium on something, we make concrete recommendations. And it's not just getting together and having a nice bull session. And I think that's perfectly proper, but I'm 72 years old. I want to see something happen. I don't want to just have a nice discussion. And so we have looked at everything from the religious community and the question of poverty in our country. When I was young, I was involved in the civil rights movement, and you had the religious community was telling us this is a moral issue. Well, poverty is a moral issue. And so we brought together everybody from Imam Wallace Muhammad, the Muslim leader, to the president of the Unitarian Church in the United States, to Pat Robertson. You can't get much further in the greater diversity than that. And but it was interesting, you know, in 2 days of meetings, pretty soon they started to come together. And then they issued a statement about the faith community and what we ought to do. And now I have to say, many religious groups aren't doing anything about it, but some are as a result of that. But we've looked at everything from the need for looking at desalination on water. We're going to be facing huge water problems in the future in the world. We just had a session not too long ago on Rwanda, where 800,000 to 1 million people were killed in Africa. What lessons can we learn from our failure to stand up there? So we do, and then we bring in speakers from both political parties. We had Jim Baker there a few weeks ago, former Secretary of State. We had Barbara Bush, as well as Democratic speakers. We had David Broder, the newspaper columnist. So we try to bring some diversity to the campus, but also to stimulate thinking. How can we improve things? How can we build a better world? That's what you've been interested in all your life.
All the time, trying to make changes in public policy, Paul.
Yeah, and that's why you have this program.
That's why we do it. It's actually an educational session that we're having, and we hope that our viewers would listen to what we have to say, especially you from your background and experience in public office. And what you're trying to do is make some action or some changes in public policy. And I admire you, Paul, because you take the guts to take a position. I mean, sometimes it's risky and it's not a popular position, but you do take a position, and that's good. We need that kind of leadership in our society.
Yeah, one of the problems is we're doing too much leadership by taking polls. Taking a poll and then doing what the poll says isn't leadership. That's just following. That's anemic. And you use the term that this is an educational program that you have. And you know who you're reaching out there and what influence they may have. And one of the things I've learned is those little things really make a difference. And let me give you a very practical illustration. About 6 weeks ago, Elizabeth Dole, Bob Dole's wife, called and said, I thought you'd be interested. I spoke in Peoria, went through the Peoria airport, and this young woman stopped me and said, could I shake your hand? And she said, of course. And she said, well, I took Paul Simon's course at Southern Illinois University, and I did a term paper about you. And she said, as a result of taking that course, I want to devote my life to public service. Now, this is a student who didn't say much. Just mostly sat in the class. You don't know whether you're reaching anybody or not. And when you and I talk into that television camera, we don't know whether we're reaching anybody or not, or whether they're sitting here, maybe falling asleep while I'm talking here right now.
Well, Paul, I just want to say this. I really appreciate you coming to the Political Roundtable and talking about Cuba and your Public Policy Institute. And if our viewers are interested in making contact, again, Paul, I would like you to repeat how they can contact you again.
Yes, and we'd be happy to send you some information about what we're doing at the Public Policy Institute. But it's the Public Policy Institute, Southern Illinois University, Carbondale, Illinois, 62901.
Now, you formed this institute in 1997?
Yes, right after I left the Senate. I went to Carbondale, to Southern Illinois University. I had all kinds of job offers after I announced I was going to leave the Senate, and I guess about 35 from various universities from Massachusetts to California. But Southern Illinois is my home, first of all, but also Southern Illinois University has a high percentage of students who are first-generation college students. Also has a high percentage of minorities. And I figure I can do more to help them than teaching at a university where, you're getting the cream of the crop.
Right.
And where those students, frankly, they don't need me as much as those students that I'm teaching down at Southern Illinois University.
Paul, I want to ask you a political question. Since this is a political roundtable, I want to ask you, are you going to run for public office again?
No. That's an easy question to answer. And I enjoyed public office. And if there are young people watching this program, I hope you'll consider it. And if I can use an illustration of why it's important. Way back when, I helped to inaugurate the policy of saying that all young people with disabilities have to be helped by our public schools. Prior to our passage of that, a lot of public schools said, if you're blind, if you're deaf, if you're in a wheelchair, we're not going to help you. A majority of the mentally retarded were being given no help by our public schools. And so we passed this legislation, and then if you have a real good memory, Augie, you may remember I tried to get the Democratic nomination for president back in 1988. Right. And I spoke at Hamilton High School in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and they knew about my involvement in passing that legislation. And they arranged for a chorus of retarded young people to sing for me.
Really?
And first they recited the preamble to the Constitution. Pretty impressive for a group of retarded.
Very impressive.
And then they sang, "This is my country."
Beautiful.
And I tell you, it shook us all. I had about a dozen reporters with me. I can remember turning around, looking in the back of the room, and there was Diane Terrell from ABC with tears running down her cheeks. And I looked at those young people, and I thought, if we hadn't passed that legislation, probably half of them would be in institutions. Is politics sometimes rough? Yes. Is it worth it? You bet.
Paul, let me say this. I know you are making a difference in people's lives. And, you know, you've been a public servant for, I don't know how many years? Almost all your life.
Too many, a lot of people will tell you.
Almost all your life, but you've made a difference. And I want to say, you know, thank you for making that difference in people's lives that you just gave an illustration. And so is there any message you want to give the viewers about the Public Institute policy or Cuba and this environment?
I think the real lesson, and first of all, whatever I've been able to contribute has been because the people of Illinois have been very good to me, and you were one of those who was very good to me. Back in 1984, when I was elected to the Senate, we had about 1 million people in Illinois who voted for Ronald Reagan and also voted for me. So I'm grateful to Republicans as well as Democrats and independents. But I think the big thing we have to keep in mind is we're a democracy, and a democracy is like a muscle. If you don't use it, you lose it. If I tied my arm to my body for 6 weeks and then untied it, I couldn't use my arm for a while. And if we don't use the muscle of democracy, if people aren't willing to participate, to vote, to become Republicans or Democrats or Green Party or Libertarians or whatever your inclination, something is happening that's not good. Through politics, we determine our future. And you ought to have a voice in determining your future, and the future of your children and your grandchildren. I hope you'll take an interest in politics. Augie, it's a pleasure to be with you always.
Paul, thank you so much for being with us this morning. And I hope you can come back again. And,
I hope you're willing to have me again.
Be glad to have you again and talk to us more about your Public Policy Institute and politics in general. And I want to thank our viewers for watching Political Roundtable. I'm Augie Sallas, and my friend Paul Simon discuss issues that are of current interest, and hope you can watch our show again. Thank you very much for watching.